This is a introduction to a series, which I'm going to do. That's Hershey. Which is going to go over the historical background, and it's going to touch on the early development of both the Way, which becomes finally Orthodox Christianity, and Pharisaical Judaism, which becomes finally Rabbinical Judaism, and the parallels that they seem to have rode to, well, we're going to stop at the First Ecumenical Council of Nicaea at 325 CE. But I want to give you guys a background. This is going to be an introduction. I'm going to lecture, basically. I'm going to go over highlights, as I always like to use. I'm going to do the Cliff Notes version, touch on highlights, but I'm going to list, of course, everything over here in which, that I touched on that you can read in more detail. I'm going to begin this lecture by basically telling you a story that I entitled "What Went Wrong." When I was a boy, growing up in Brooklyn, though I went to yeshiva, to Hebrew school basically as a boy on Sundays and Thursdays, I went to public school during the week. And as my earliest recollections of interfacing with people who are Christians was about as early as my my first year of school, in my first grade. I found that my grandmother, we lived 3 generations in a household, my grandparents, my parents, and me and my 2 sisters in Brooklyn. And my grandmother was very Orthodox, super Orthodox, in fact, and my father was not. At my grandmother's request and against my father's better judgment, my grandmother allowed me to grow payot, which is those little curls that you see on ultra-Orthodox Jewish people. And I remember an incident where I was coming out of school, I was alone, and I got encircled by a bunch of kids, Irish, Italian, they're Catholic. And they kept yelling at me, "You're a Christ killer." I had no idea what that meant at the time. And grabbed my payas and whacked my head against a fire hydrant. I fought my way out, if you want to call it fighting your way out of a situation like that. And I got home, my nose was broken, my forehead was split open, I was crying, and I recalled this whole story to my father, and I was sitting on a hassock. And against my grandmother's pleading and crying, my father took a pair of cloth shears and cut off the payas. And then in 1983, a number of years later, I was 13, 14, smarter, a little bit more streetwise, and somebody approached me that I would find out later was part of Jews for Jesus, and explained to me that not only was I not a Christ killer, but Jesus was a Jew and a rabbi. And for my previous experience, and plus other experiences that I had through life at that point in time, confused me. Which brought me to deciding to go to college, and primarily going to search the Dead Sea Scrolls. In 1989, I was a junior at the King's College, and I was studying advanced biblical studies with a gentleman named Dr. Scott McClellan. Now, Dr. McClellan was a very, at that time, the guy for theology. His PhD was from Oxford. The reason why I know that is every chance he could tell you that he graduated from Oxford and not from some American university. He did. Anyway, after 2.5, 3 years of studying the original languages and the documents and the historical ecumenical writings and the writings of the early church fathers, he made a statement. Precursed that statement, I want to tell you something else. My two favorite philosophers is Francis Bacon and Descartes. Francis Bacon, the father of modern science, as we understand it, empirical knowledge, is if you can see it and observe it, then it must be. And Descartes says, I think, therefore I exist, and what I think, therefore exists. So here are the two rails of a train: knowledge, from Francis Bacon, and faith, or perspective, from Descartes. What rides on that train, what rides on those rails is the train called religion. Well, if you lose one of those rails, you have what they call derailment. And it usually involves train cars crashing, people dying, and it's not a pretty thing. Well, I experienced a train derailment that very day in October 1989. After all that I had been taught, Dr. Scott McClellan was in the middle of a conversation in a lecture, and he said, there are two perspectives. You have the historical Jesus and the Jesus of faith. We must stay with the Jesus of faith and maybe not ignore it, but place it to the side, because the faith is more important than the actual man, Jesus. This, for me, was the La Cosa Nostra, the unspoken thing that everybody had been doing for decades and centuries. We know who Jesus was as a person, historically, and we also know that he doesn't match up with the Jesus of faith. So we're going to ignore one of the rails and just try to ride on a monorail. This is why I'm doing this series. When I saw that derailment, that horrible train crash, that crash didn't start in 1989. It's been going on for 1700 years, and people have died and lost their lives. Many of them innocent and unaware that one of the rails wasn't holding up. So what I'm going to do, this is the last of my opinion portion. In the next sections, I'm going to go over from approximately 300 or 400, well, about 400 BCE, and we're going to end right at the Council of Nicaea. And we're going to see the characters and people who were historical people who basically leaned and guided both what is now known as Orthodox Christianity and Rabbinical Judaism. I'm not going to comment on it. I'm just going to give you the information. It is your responsibility, just like it was mine in 1989, to decide whether you're going to stay with one rail or have an even keel and look at two rails and see which you wish to base on. My purpose at that point in 1989 was that I had that epiphany and said, no, I'm going to look and see what happened. And when the point in which the historical Jesus and the faith Jesus peeled off, that's where I will cut my Occam's razor. I'm going to go through all these ancient medieval philosophers. I'm going to cut from there. I'm going to come back to where the tree did not split off. That's me. You have to make your own decisions. I'm here only, at this point, I'm not going to be discussing theology. I'm going to be discussing history. So I hope you enjoy the series. It will be in a lecture format, and I apologize for that. But I'm going to cover stuff, and you will be required to do your own research. All right, folks. So the next section will be the beginning, and we'll discuss what was going on just before Jesus' time, the historical Jesus, and what happened after he left this planet. All right, folks. Peace.